the thing with food is that you always have to have a connection. There always has to be something that brings it back for you. When you combine really bizarre flavors together just for the sake of combining new things together, you end up with something that somebody's like, oh, they'll taste it and they'll say, hey, this is interesting. But rarely do you want somebody to say about your food, oh, it's interesting. What you want people to say is yum, right? It's good, it's tasty. And the way that you do that is by bringing the familiar back into it.
Native Americans use every part of the animal that they kill. That's just a really old, that's a thing that everyone's heard that. You heard that when you're a little kid. As soon as I say it, you're like, oh, right. But it's not something you're thinking about all the time. It's not like a current events thing where you're kind of sick of hearing about it. You haven't probably thought about that. Even though it's right below the tip of your consciousness, you probably haven't thought about that for years. But as soon as I say it, you recognize that.
And you'd say to yourself, okay, peas and carrots, awesome. Where do I go from there? That's when you get creative, right? You bring in all these awesome sort of scientific techniques into it and ways of transforming the different vegetables. And you bring in, modern ways of dealing with produce, and you bring in sort of ways that people have been making, food interesting for the last 100 years, purees and gels and snows and foams and all this stuff that you see nowadays.
Telling one line, at least the way I tell a one-liner, I'm coming up with a kind of a new way or a different way of thinking about the set. I tell setup, and then the punchline is a different way of thinking about it. And in order for that to kind of be at all interesting to people, the setup has to be something very, very bland. I'm constantly dealing with the setup is too interesting. I read an interesting fact in Wikipedia, and I'm like, oh, well that, and then I have a kind of funny take on it. But I'm like, well, if I tell people that fact, they're just going to be thinking, they're like, oh, that's a new thing, I haven't heard that before. And they're not going to kind of respond to the joke.
I found the fountain of youth, but it was in Mexico, so I couldn't drink the water.
It can be awesome and super creative and super scientific, and it can look gorgeous and spectacular, and you could have used every ounce of creativity in your body to make it as spectacular as possible. But ultimately, you get the yum from the familiar notion that people have of peas and carrots.